come before you humbly and ask for your guidance, your direction, your wisdom with everything that I speak today. I ask that your Spirit would lead me and guide me for each thing. Don't let me miss any details, and urge me on when there's something I need to emphasize. I thank you and I praise you for your word, and we are ready to dig in. So we ask that your Spirit would lead us and guide us into all truth. In Yeshua's name, amen. Well, we're going to introduce Daniel. We need to know who he is to understand why this man is so important. There is historical context that we need to look at so we understand the whole process. We go back to 970 to 931 BCE. This is at the time of King Solomon's reign. And he reigned over a united Israel. However, he married multiple foreign wives. He then brought paganism into Israel. It brought a curse on the land, and then Israel split from Judah, the northern and the southern kingdom. In 930 BCE, Solomon died. His son Rehoboam took over Israel, instituting excessive taxation. 10 tribes rebelled against him and followed Jeroboam, who was an Ephraimite, who took over the northern kingdom called Israel. Rehoboam kept control over the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the southern kingdom called Judah. Jeroboam led Israel into idolatry. The northern and southern kingdoms continued the idolatry and wickedness and instability for 178 years. Now we're at the year 752. This is Menachem, who assassinated the king of Israel, and he seized the throne. He entered an alliance with this massive Assyrian empire. He paid a large tribute in exchange for military protection. We find that in 2 Kings 15. Israel then became a vassal state of the Assyrian Empire. Now, you may know about the Assyrian Empire. They were pretty wicked toward Israel. So this is an interesting piece when we find that the Assyrian Empire is conquered. In 725 to 722 BCE, Israel's capital, you've heard of Samaria, was besieged by the Assyrians. Israel then collapsed. The people were dispersed throughout Assyria, and Israel then ceased to exist. Now we're looking at 612 to 609 BCE. There's a Babylonian king named Nabopolassar. With the help from the Medes, the separate empire, attacked Assyria's capital city, Nineveh. You've heard of Nineveh and Jonah. So they were attacked, and then that weakened the Assyrian Empire. Now we're at 605 BCE. Enter Daniel. The Assyrian Empire collapsed. Then Nabopolassar's son, you've heard of him, Nebuchadnezzar II, became the king. Judah became a vassal state of Babylon. Daniel, who was about age 15, was exiled to Babylon in the first deportation from Judah with elite youth of royal lineage. We see the story in Daniel 1. 597 BCE, Ezekiel, you know Ezekiel, right? He was exiled to Babylon in the second deportation from Judah, which included the king of Judah, royal officials, priests, and craftsmen. You find the story in 2 Kings 24. And then Ezekiel began to prophesy to the exiles. Now we go to 586 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar II besieged Jerusalem for 18 months. He attacked. Finally, Solomon's temple was burned to the ground. Most people exiled to Babylon We see the story in 2 Kings 25, Jeremiah 52, Lamentation 1 through 5, and it's including the ancestors of Mordecai and Esther. You've heard of them. So their ancestors were part of this exile. We see that in Esther 2, 5 to 6. So who was Babylon? Well, we know about the worldwide flood. Genesis 10, 1 to 9 says that Noah fathered Ham, who fathered Cush, who fathered Nimrod, who was called a mighty hunter. Genesis 10:10, Nimrod's kingdom included Bavel, which we know as Babylon, in the land of Shinar. Genesis 11:1, the entire earth spoke the same language. Genesis 11:4, they decided to make a name for themselves and build a tower to reach into the heavens. They wanted to get into God's domain without asking God's permission. That was Babel, Babylon. The word Babel actually means confused. It was a good description. That's what God did for them. Genesis 11, 6 to 9. Adonai said, "Look, the people are united. They all have a single language, and see what they're starting to do? At this rate, nothing they set out to accomplish will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse their language so they won't understand each other, and their speech will be utterly confused." So from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth. They stopped building the city. For this reason, it is called Bavel, which is confusion. Because there, Adonai confused the language of the whole world. The whole earth was now messed up, couldn't communicate. And from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth. Now, the word Bavel and the word Babel, they are actually, in the Hebrew, the same word. It's just a slightly different pronunciation of the B and the V. It's the exact same letter in Hebrew. Okay, now we have a judgment that comes upon Israel, and this is during the time of Abraham. Nimrod was a tyrannical ruler over Babel, and he tried to turn the people away from God. Isn't that the way Satan does things? Always. Centuries later, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to the foot of Mount Sinai. God instructed them to observe a Sabbath of the land every 7 years, to sow and reap for 6 years, and let the land rest in the Sabbath year, Leviticus 25. However, for 70 sabbatical years, the Israelites failed to let the land rest, so God removed them from their land. 70 years of exile would repay the land for the 70 missed Sabbaths, and that's why they ended up in Babylon. They lost the use of their land. Remember, when the first man and the first woman left the garden, they were promised the land. They were going to take care of the land. Well, here it happens now that they are disconnected from the very land that was promised to them. Babylon, or Bavel, began as a small port town on the Euphrates River. It grew into one of the largest cities of the ancient world. King Nebuchadnezzar II ruled the Babylonian Empire for 43 years, beginning in 605 to 604 BCE. That was his first year. And it was the most powerful empire, and he was the most religious king in the ancient world. God used Nebuchadnezzar II to execute the judgment over the Israelites because they disregarded the Sabbaths of the land. Under Moses, the Israelites had been freed from Pharaoh and his Egyptian gods. Now in Babylon, they were subjected to King Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian gods. So who is Daniel? That's what we really need to know. That's the context that he's come from. He's about 15 years old at the time of the exile. Daniel 1:3 says he is the son of Israel from royal descent and nobility. He's an elite noble. Daniel 1:4, he's a youth, handsome, proficient in all wisdom, knowledgeable, intelligent, and capable of serving in the king's palace. I've got to remember, Daniel is the one who wrote that. Wow, that's what he thought of himself. Daniel 1:6, from the people of Yehuda. These were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we know the other fellows as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel was highly esteemed. Ezekiel talked about him. Remember, he was a contemporary. He was a part of the exiles. He described Daniel as righteous and wise. Yeshua referred to Daniel as a prophet. Imagine Yeshua selects him and says, pay attention to this man. He has the words we need to hear. Daniel served many kings from 15 years old until probably his late 80s or early 90s. Daniel lived from 620 to 538, and in 605 BCE, at 15 years old, he and his friends were exiled to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar of the Assyrian Empire. He trained for 3 years to serve with the king's wise men. Remember the wise men? The Magi. He was one of the Magi. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel became prime minister over all the satraps. You see that word in the book of Esther. Those are governors of the Assyrian provinces. He was chief over all the Magi. We see it in Daniel 2. He later worked under Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Under Darius the Mede, Daniel became one of the 3 leaders of the Median Empire. We see that in Daniel chapter 5. Under Cyrus the Great, Daniel served the highest position in the Persian Empire. So he's working for the Babylonian Empire, then the Medo-Persian Empire, and essentially he is serving 3 different kings. Now, the book of Daniel begins and ends in Hebrew. That was his language of origin. That was the language of Israel and Judah. However, there was the Aramaic language at Babylon. And he used the Aramaic in the middle chapters, and we'll see why as we get into this. Then you have probably heard of the Septuagint. This was the Greek version, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint version of the book of Daniel was translated into Greek and has additional text over and above what is in the Hebrew Bible. 8 manuscript copies of the book of Daniel in both Hebrew and Aramaic were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were found in 3 of the 11 caves at Qumran. Only 2 Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint book of Daniel have been found. Daniel's book is referenced by 1st century Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus in his book Antiquities of the Jews. It was widely read and it was studied in the 1st century. Everybody knew about the book of Daniel. Chapters 1 through 6 contain historical records, and chapters 7 through 12 contain prophetic information. So what are these prophecies? Well, Daniel describes a vision of the Son of Man in Daniel 7. In chapter 8 and 9, he has visits from Gabriel and another angel who battled alongside of Michael. He's the only person in all of the Bible who had the appearances from Gabriel and Michael. It's the only one. Doesn't that already underscore the importance of Daniel? He prophesied the fall of Babylon by the Medo-Persians. He prophesied the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire by Alexander the Great. He prophesied the split of the Greek Empire. He prophesied the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus IV, and he foretold about the Roman Empire and the coming of the Messiah, the exact time of his crucifixion, and something called the time of the Gentiles. This is an important prophet. He has his fingerprints all over history, all over history. Daniel's prophecies are still unfolding regarding Europe, Rome, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and the time just before Yeshua returns. Do you think he's an important prophet? Yeah, he certainly is. Now, we look at Isaiah 39, and he talks about this time that we're going to discuss. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear what Adonai Tsavuot says. The day will come when everything in your palace, along with everything your ancestors stored up until today, will be carried off to Bavel. Nothing will be left, says Adonai. They will carry off some of your descendants, your own offspring, and they will be made eunuchs, serving in the palace of the king of Bavel." That was Daniel. He was made a eunuch. It was common practice in Babylon for the slaves to be castrated. We see that in Josephus' book, The Antiquities. It's chapter 10. Daniel was required to become a eunuch. So were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why was that? Because if they could castrate them, they could make sure that they had no interest in women and romantic pursuits, and they would serve the king for life. So for 3 years, Daniel and his friends were trained under King Nebuchadnezzar's chief eunuch. And we see that in Daniel 1, verse 3. Now, Amos 3 tells us this. Adonai God does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. So Daniel was one of those prophets who got so many revelations in his lifetime. Daniel was from a priestly family. The Talmud states that Daniel's lineage was from Zadokite priesthood. Jeremiah was also from a priestly lineage. He was living in Anathoth, a Levitical city. They were living at the same time. Daniel was living in Jerusalem, while Jeremiah was living only a few miles northeast of Jerusalem. Jeremiah was about 30 years older than Daniel, and Daniel knew of Jeremiah's reputation as a local prophet. He also knew about Jeremiah's warning to Judah. We're going to look at the warning. This is the word that came to Yirmiyahu, that's Jeremiah, concerning all the people of Yehuda in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Yoshiahu, that's Josiah, king of Judah. This was also the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel. Here is the word. Therefore, here is what Adonai Tsavuot says, because you haven't paid attention to what I've been saying, I'm going to send for all the families of the north, says Adonai, and for my servant Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel, and bring them against this land, against its inhabitants, and against all the surrounding nations. This entire land will become a ruin, a waste, and these nations will serve the king of Bavel for how many years? 70. Just remember that, 70 years. 70 years were required to repay 70 missed Shabbats. 2 Chronicles 36, 18 to 21. All the articles in the house of God, great and small, the supplies in the house of Adonai, and the supplies of the king and his leading men, all these he brought to Bavel. Then they burned down the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, put to flames all its palaces, and destroyed everything in it of worth. Those who had escaped the sword he carried off to Bavel, and they became slaves to him, and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Thus was fulfilled the word of Adonai spoken by Yirmiyahu, until the land has been paid for her Shabbats. For as long as it lay desolate, it kept Shabbat until 70 years had passed. Do you see how important Shabbat is to God? We have our weekly Shabbat, we know about that, but this every 7 years Shabbat, the 7 years of resting the land, that was also important. And he was saying to them, you're getting kicked out because you didn't take care of the land and let it rest. 70 Shabbats you missed, you're going to repay 70 years. 2 Kings 24, 8-17 says this. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began his reign. He was a pretty young king. He ruled in Jerusalem for 3 months. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the example of everything his father had done. It was then that the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, marched on Jerusalem and laid siege to the city, carried away from there all the treasures in the house of Adonai and the treasures in the royal palace. He cut in pieces all the articles of gold which Shlomo, Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of Adonai, as Adonai had said would happen. He carried all Jerusalem away captive, all the princes, all the bravest soldiers, 10,000 captives, also all the craftsmen and the metal, excuse me, and the metal workers. No one was left but the poorest people of the land. They didn't want the poor folks. They wanted all the rich folks. They wanted the ones who had some assets. They took them. So what do we know about this Nebuchadnezzar? This is taken from a website, internationalstandardbible.com. Of all the heathen monarchs mentioned by name in the scriptures, Nebuchadnezzar is the most prominent and the most important. The prophecies of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and the last chapters of Kings and Chronicles centered about his life, and he stands preeminent among the foes of the kingdom of God. Nebuchadnezzar succeeded his father on the throne of Babylon in 604 BC. He reigned until 561 BC. He was a very religious man, probably excelling all who had preceded him in the building of temples and in the institution of offerings and the observance of all the ceremonies connected with the worship of the gods. That was Nebuchadnezzar. Josephus, the historian, he was living a little bit after the time of Yeshua. He wrote about the Tower of Babel, that it was built in Assyria by Nimrod in rebellion against God, but continual military campaigns against Babylon destroyed the tower. However, it was rebuilt in 610 BCE, overseen by King Nabopolassar, that's the father of Nebuchadnezzar II, who then took the throne later. The new Tower of Babel had been in place only a few years before Daniel was exiled to Babylon. Perhaps some of those holy temple vessels were brought into the new Tower of Babel. And there's a picture of it on the next slide. And what you see is a structure called a ziggurat. That is a structure on the bottom, and then a little bit smaller, and then another layer, another. That's the ziggurat, okay? Archaeologists confirm that a ziggurat existed in Babel, a temple to Marduk. That was one of their main gods, Marduk. The first tier on the bottom was 110 feet tall. The second tier was 60 feet tall, and then 20, 20, 20, and 20 feet tall, with the top at about 60 feet tall. The temple was called Etemanatki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The ruins can still be seen in modern-day Iraq. That was our Tower of Babel. And it was rebuilt during the time of Daniel. So Daniel's story actually begins with the exiles. He's living in Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, during the reign of the evil king Jehoiakim. The king had mocked and defied the prophet Jeremiah, which brought judgment upon the king. God doesn't take it very well when we mock his prophets. He does not take it kindly. Daniel 1:1-2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Yehuda, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Adonai handed Jehoiakim, king of Yehuda, over to him, along with some of the articles from the house of God. He took them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the articles in the storehouse of his God. Now remember, Daniel is writing this in Hebrew. He's a brand new exile. He's still not fully accustomed to using Aramaic. Daniel 1:3-4. The king ordered Ashpenaz, the eunuch serving as his chief officer, to bring into the palace from the people of Israel some of royal or noble descent. They were to be boys without physical defect, handsome in appearance, versed in all kinds of wisdom, quick to learn, discerning, and having the capacity to serve in the king's palace. And he was to teach them the language and literature of the Kasdim. Kasdim is the Chaldeans. Now, the language in Babylon was Akkadian, also called Chaldean. Aramaic, we've all heard of that, was the lingua franca that was used in trade and administration. Thus, Daniel wrote some of his chapters in Aramaic because they were about trade and administration, but some were in Hebrew. This first chapter is Hebrew. Daniel 1:5-8. The king assigned them a daily portion of his own food and the wine he drank, which was not kosher, and they were to be cared for in this way for 3 years. At the end of this time, they were to become the king's attendants. Among these, from the people of Yehuda, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief officer gave them other names. To Daniel, which means God is my judge, he gave the name Belteshazzar, which means Bel, a god, protects his life. To Hananiah, Shadrach, and Mishael, he said they were Meshach, Meshach, and to Azariah it was Abednego. These new names were evoking Babylonian gods. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. Sorry, I only eat kosher, he said. That's it. So he asked the chief officer to be excused from defiling himself. God caused the chief officer to be kind and sympathetic toward Daniel. However, the chief officer said to Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king. After all, he has given you an allowance of food and drink. So if he were to see you boys looking worse than the others your age, you would be putting my own head in danger from the king." Okay, what's he worried about? Well, if I don't feed you the king's food and I give you this other stuff, whatever that is, I don't think you're going to be so healthy. No, it was the opposite. Then Daniel said to the guard whom the chief officer had put in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please try an experiment on your servants. For 10 days have them give us only vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then see how we look and compare us with how the boys who eat the king's food look. and then deal with your servants according to what you see. Now, why did they choose vegetables? Because vegetables are all kosher. They're all acceptable. It's the meats we have to watch out for. And so Daniel was saying, I'm not touching those meats. I'm not going to touch them. So Daniel then agreed, the officer agreed. He agreed to do what they had asked and gave them a 10-day test. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and more robust than all the boys who were eating the king's food. So the guard took away their food and the wine they were supposed to drink and gave them vegetables. The Greek Septuagint says seeds or pulse. It doesn't say vegetables, but seeds, they grow vegetables, don't they? Some fish and other animals are also not kosher. So if you just have vegetables, you're safe. So to these 4 boys, God had given knowledge and skill in every aspect of learning and wisdom. Moreover, Daniel could understand all kinds of visions and dreams. There are good things about eating vegetables, okay? Very good things. He got a lot of understanding. Now, some people call this the Daniel fast, vegetables and water only. It's a popular thing these days, the Daniel fast. Cleaning eating will sharpen our mental and our spiritual acuity. So that's what they were doing. Daniel 1:18, when the time the king had set for them to be presented came, which was 3 years, the chief officer presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And when the king spoke with them, none was found among all of them to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. And in all matters requiring wisdom and understanding, whenever the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and exorcists in his entire kingdom. So Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Koresh, that's Cyrus. So in his very first chapter, he starts with telling us that he was chosen from the exiles and brought there and trained. And at the end of the chapter, he says, I was in this kingdom all the way through to the time of King Cyrus, okay? Cyrus the Great. We see him in Isaiah 45. He founded the Persian Empire. He reigned from 559 to 530 BCE. In 539 BCE, he conquered Babylon. In 538, he decreed that the Jewish exiles could return home. So let's go over the summary of what we've talked about. Nimrod is the great-grandson of Noah. Nimrod led the construction of the Tower of Babel. Babel was a place of wickedness and defiance against God. God's people ignored the order to keep the land Sabbaths. Isaiah and Jeremiah delivered warnings to them, but they were ignored. 70 missed land Sabbaths brought 70 years of exile. Prophetic warnings about the Babylonian exile came to pass. The Tower of Babel was destroyed due to multiple military campaigns against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the tower. Nebuchadnezzar was called God's servant. Why do you think that was? Because he executed the judgments against Israel that were planned against them. He was the servant of God. Daniel and his friends, all of royal descent, were among the first group of exiles to Babylon. They were chosen for their youth, wisdom, and the royal and priestly bloodlines. Daniel and his friends maintained kosher diets. Thus, they were endowed with supernatural wisdom and understanding. That concludes the first chapter of Daniel. What we're going to do at this point I'm going to pray to close this, and then we're going to go ahead and just stand up and walk around a little bit, and then we'll come to part 2. Okay? Let's pray. Father, thank you for the word. Thank you for teaching us about Daniel. Lord, show us what we need to know to be followers of you. Daniel was a wonderful follower of you, and we want to exhibit that kind of wisdom and that kind of supernatural acuity that he had. So teach us, Lord, as we go through the series. In Yeshua's name, amen.